Welcome to the Serial Intellectual Podcast. I am the Serial Intellectual, creating intellectual products that transform people and change the world. And today we start a series called My Worst Day. It's a podcast that is designed to encourage you and I and everyone around the world, especially when they're on their worst day. It's designed to give you inspiration and hope and even teach you a few lessons. There's so many people going through so many things. And often we're really good at celebrating successes and not so good at learning from and being inspired from some of our tougher times. And today I have with me a very good friend of mine. His name is Dan Hyun. You're going to learn a little bit about him and one of his worst days. So, Dan, welcome to the podcast.
It's
And
great to be here.
Sweet. And why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, like where you were born and where you grew up, where you went to school?
Yeah, I was born in Chicago, but spent most of my life growing up in the Philadelphia area. Went to Penn State University, and then the rest is history after that.
Nice. Um, what do you do now for work?
Yeah, I continue to serve with our church, but my main work is to help pastors throughout the region here.
Ah, so not only do you have a testimony about your worst day, but I'm sure you're helping many men and women through theirs as well. Before we get into the nitty gritty about your worst day, tell us one fun fact about you, something that someone might not know about Dan Hyun.
Um, well, one is my superpower is Tetris. So I until a couple of weeks ago when I found out a kid broke Tetris, that I used to be able to brag that was my superpower above anyone else.
Wow, I didn't even know that.
Yeah.
And I've known you for a while. I thought you were going to say one of your many books or conference speaker or you're a great friend and you're a great solutionist, but Tetris.
I'm
Wow,
shallow. Yeah, I'm shallow. That's
you've been holding out on me, man. You've been holding out on me. All right, Dan. Tell us a little bit about kind of your your worst day. What was it? What was it like?
yeah, I don't know what this says about me, but when you first asked me, I felt like a letterman. I could do a top 10 list of the 10 worst days, but if I had to choose, probably most naturally was the day we found out our daughter was diagnosed with leukemia.
Uh, yeah, that's rough. And how did you find that news out? Were you at the doctor or was your wife with her? How did that happen?
Well, she had actually been sick earlier in the year, and then we had thought that there was, genuine healing, and she was doing better. But then she started to get sick again. Went in the hospital, and we had some suspicions. But yeah, I think there's something about even when you're saying the worst day, like something's about to happen, but actually hearing from someone's mouth, it makes it more real or more grave or something.
Yeah. And do you recall like some of the things you were feeling and thinking when you got that news? Like were you actually in the room when you got the news or did you get it when you got home? Like where were you?
If I remember, I think I actually got it secondhand from my wife, not because I'm an absentee father who doesn't want to be there, but this was right at the beginning of COVID time where only one person could be in the hospital at a time. So basically, everything was having to be transferred through the other.
Wow. Wow. And I'm sure there's so many people that have went through things in COVID. And I until you said that, I totally forgot about that. How many people in terms of like pregnancies and deaths and sicknesses where you were was only one person allowed to go to the hospital.
Yep.
Wow, that's crazy. And so you get the news. Do you recall like I'm sure you went through a whole range of emotions. Do you recall any one emotion being stronger than the other or any one thought being stronger than the other?
Yeah, this is almost going to be hard to believe, but I don't think it was despondency at first. Honestly, I think there's a part of me that went into hero mode or what do I need to do, which I think is probably aligned to how I respond to most things. So, what can I do to make this better? And so it wasn't the TV show. You hear the news and you break down there, weep. It wasn't that at all. but it was more, what do I need to do now to make this better?
Ah. Did you find yourselves, and how long did that period of time last? Was it like a long time, or was it like cut short by something?
I mean, obviously, on one end, there was a terrible sense of grief for my daughter, for my wife, just for the family, for others. In a weird way, not as much for myself as much as others were feeling bad for me and our family. It is, again, there's probably a lot of dysfunction within my soul, but it lasted for a while where almost there was a rush of the adrenaline of what do we need to do now, even getting the word out and share. It was almost like a shot of, hey, here's a real, it's just terrible, but this is something that we can do something with this. So
Mhm.
it lasted a little while, but I would say, and I know you're going to ask it later, some of the different challenges of the worst day. For me, my worst day wasn't actually just reserved to the worst day. I think seeing the ripple effects of that, I think that was the hardest thing of my worst day.
Wow. So talk to us about that. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so when the actual hearing the news, that was terrible, but I think there was a part of me, and I remember when this really hit me. When I thought cancer, I go to the movies where you hear and you see the imagery of people getting sick and you just pound it out with them. And for a few weeks or maybe, for a short time, it's just terrible, but like something to conquer. And I remember when the doctors started telling us, I don't think I even fully received the news. I heard them. I was like, yeah, yeah, yeah. But realized when they said, yeah, this is about a 2.5 to 3.5 year journey, depending on the child and their illness. And I think even hearing that didn't fully register until that rush of response mode, crisis mode kind of settled down,
Mhm.
realizing this is just what we're in for the next few years, and really nothing's going to change. Doesn't
Wow.
mean that we're helpless fully, but at the same time, kind of were helpless, other than just being there and walking through it. And I think for me, that was the hardest thing, maybe even beyond that worst day of finding out that news, realizing this is just going to be our reality for the next few years.
Yeah. And what is it that you think made that part hard? Because there was the initial, and then it seems like when you heard it was 2, 3 years, it seems like, correct me if I'm wrong, that's when the weight of everything settled in. What was it about that?
Yeah, well, I think what it did is, and I think it was challenging because there were so many different facets involved with different members of the family and how they're all receiving it. Obviously, the one going through treatment herself, but then family members, siblings, parents, grandparents, family, church members, and in my mind, I almost was trying to think of how is everyone doing with this,
Mm.
and and
Mm.
and even the way we would communicate the stories. I remember early on there was almost, again, it sounds totally terrible. If hopefully people give me grace, but I almost felt like it was a mission to be able to share and to be able to tell people the power of their prayers and the redemptive aspects of that and how God was using it. And maybe that's the pastor side of me having to turn everything into this like good story of how God's present, which I absolutely believe he was present. But when that started to wear down and things really didn't change, it was just what it was. Even people's empathy was there, but that goes away after a while, and you realize this is just what you're in. And for me, who's used to, you give me a problem, as terrible as it feels, I'm going to do my best to try to fix it, realizing my limitations. I There's just not much I could do with it other than being there.
Yeah. Yeah. So much of our worst days are really about surviving the initial news or providence or circumstances. But really, when it starts to set in and those limitations and losses start to hit, and that's what it sounds like what was happening with you and your wife and your kids. And that's like not so. Um, how long's it been now?
Yeah, so since the original diagnosis, our daughter has been treatment free. So one of the good things, and again, every child is different. So, but for our child, it was bad, but it wasn't as bad as it is for some. So she just had the normal treatment. She finished her formal treatment in June of 22. So this summer is going to be 2 years since she's been done treatment, which they don't really use words like remission for children. It's just more cancer free.
Right. Well, Dan, what would you say, like to someone who said, "That's a lot." Like, how did you get through that? Like, how did you do that?
Um, I don't know if I fully have. That might not be helpful for a podcast like this, where you're.
Oh, I think that's honest
Yeah,
for
I so
once.
yeah. Well, I think there's two parts of it. One, absolutely, I have. I think part of it is really trying to view things through the lens of sanctification. And I shared a story with as many people as I can who are suffering. I remember a good friend of a friend who's, if you would hear them, they're pretty well known, and they had gone through some stuff that was secret to me. It was a surprise to me with their family. And he did a call with me in the beginning of the treatment, and I remember him saying, as bad as it was with their family, he and his wife, they agree, and they were beyond it at that point. They would not trade the sanctification that they received during that hellish time.
Mm.
And I was like, that's ridiculous. That's just trying to sound really spiritual.
Yeah.
But I think there's that part of it I absolutely see. And again, I don't want to speak for other members of my family, but I think that's been part of it. But for me, at least, there's absolutely a sense I'm a different person, even in my relationship with God, but just as an individual than I am, than I was before then, and through the whole process. And I think even relating it to ministry or work, one feedback I've gotten kind of indirectly from other people that I've heard from others is people saying I'm a much more gentle leader than I ever used to be, in a
Wow.
good way.
Wow.
And I think I would attribute some of it to the broken, refining fire of going through those times of realizing I couldn't just power my way through things. I couldn't bully things to happen. I couldn't
Mm.
exert my will. Cancer is what it is, and you just have to exist through it. Trust in God, trust that He's enough. All those things that we believe, but they're
Mhm.
actually put into practice. And I can absolutely see that in my life. I am a better person, leader, hopefully family member, all these different things than I was before. Hopefully not that I was trash before, but and other people could speak into that, but I think I can see God's presence in using even this fire in my life. But having said all that, there is a sense where, again, the worst day for me at least, you just continue to feel repercussions from that, like threads, like you're weeding in the garden. You think you get all the weeds, but you realize there's some weeds that are still there growing, even if you can't see them. And every so often, particularly with certain triggers, they're brought up, and I would tie them back to that worst day and feelings of helplessness, feelings of lack of ability to do anything. My presence was not enough, whatever it is.
Wow. That's crazy. It's if someone were to ask what, there's certainly a process through this whole thing where not only is your daughter in need of medical treatment in order to physically heal, but you and your family as well to healing. What what is what's one thing that's helped you along this journey? Is there a thing or a practice you've done or something you've been exposed to or something that's happened or is continuing to happen, something you're doing that's helping you along this journey, but specifically in terms of you being more wholesome as you spoke to
Yeah.
through this whole process?
And I think this is where every person processes differently. For me, I am a verbal processor. So I think the harder things of a journey like this was people, obviously, they felt bad, but I think so often we don't know what to say, or we don't, or I think, giving the benefit of the doubt, people don't want to intrude. They want to give space. But for me, at least, and again, I think others are different. They need that space. They don't want everyone in their business. For me, that was almost harder, where people would just see things on yes, because at the time I was still having to function in other areas of life. So in some ways I look like I'm doing okay. But I think having people asking, so how are you actually doing with this stuff? I think one, it gave a sense of validation that people still see, especially when the initial rush of, oh, someone has cancer. Everyone responds, but then that dies down. The people who are still kind of there asking, and just giving the freedom for me to be able to process out loud, even if I want to say I'm doing okay, even if I'm not, but just giving that freedom there. But I think more in a personal rhythm, I think is just creating space, um, just for reflection, spiritual meditation, whatever it needed to be. Um, and I think I felt really guilty about this initially, but
Uh,
I remember
talk
even
about that.
during, yeah, even during the treatment, I realized for me, and this has been a lifelong process, I need space away. Even if though I'm a people person, extrovert, I need space away. But during something like cancer, feeling like, well, I can't do that. I mean, my kid's sick, my wife has got all that. What kind of jerk would I be? And obviously the initial times when it was really highly intensive, there was no space for that. But as things started to settle down, realizing one of the healthiest things for me to do was to take a few days away and fight against that guilt, saying, well, you can't do this. This is not a season for that. But realizing for me, that's one of those things of learning and knowing my own rhythms that help me to be able to center, to get perspective, to pray, obviously, but also to lament. And just whereas in the normal rhythms of life for me, it's difficult to find that time to center myself in those practices.
Ah, you you had to, as I've been saying to everyone, you probably had to have a conversation with your guilt,
Yep.
and you guys had to sit at the table, right? Work some things out because I'd imagine your guilt was heavy. And you're a people person, and you said in the beginning, like you want to help people and you don't want anyone to suffer. And so I imagine as well, not only did you have to deal like emotionally, but also with your desire to try to make everything better when you couldn't. And it seems like there was some type of kind of wholesome resignation happening, it sounds like in your words.
Yeah. And I think, the reality of it, it's been a whole lesson on facing limits and realizing how God works in that. And that's something I've preached on for years. So it's not a new concept, but I think it took on a different flavor initially, obviously, with just the illness itself and the limitations that I'm not God. I'm not even a doctor. I can't do, literally, I can do nothing about this other than to be present and trust that God and the people are enough. But I think also limitations in terms of I felt like I could still function in the rest of my life normally and still be high capacity and do everything that I always did. And this is on the side and it's really hard, but I can gut it out. And I think having to have some hard realizations that there were things that suffered in my life that I was not as sharp or invested or able to do as I would have wanted. And I feel a little bad because I think I put some people probably in bad places because I didn't say I can't do this. I'm like, no, I'm good. I can still do this.
Mm,
So that it was complicated. I'm still processing that because part of me wishes there would have been people who said, yeah, you shouldn't do that. But just the way I'm wired, people are probably not going to say that to me. So I've had to learn I need to speak into myself in
mm,
those similar learning from those worst day kind of principles. How do
yeah,
I also respond in current times when it's too much, which has
yeah,
never been, that's never even been an option.
yeah. Wow. So you kind of hit on some of this, but can you tell us like maybe one thing you have learned amongst the many that stands out to you about having gone through your worst day? What's something you've learned about yourself?
Yeah. Well, I hate not being in control. So that
Welcome to
itself,
the club.
yeah, I know that's something no one else struggles with, but
Yeah, yeah.
um, I whether it's pride or arrogance or in some ways there's some validation. I can make things happen. I could do nothing here. So I think part of what I had to learn, and maybe even it became a rhythm of health for me, was recognize what is out of my control other
Mm,
than being present.
mm,
Recognize those, own those, not have to apologize for them, not have to be guilty about them. Trust that God is enough, even if it doesn't feel like it to me,
mm,
but also identify what is within my control still.
mm.
some things are, there's no way I can determine someone's illness or health. What I can determine is my own health, for example. So for me, it, ironically, maybe providentially, I remember the day, I think it was the second day after Tabitha got diagnosed, my daughter, I got a call from my doctor. Again, wife and I are tag teaming back and forth. I'm at home, mad, walking around the yard outside of our home. And I got a call. I was assuming it was just another person wishing us well, or because we were getting a lot of that. So I picked it up, and it was actually my doctor. I forgot I had been into the doctor the week before for just a normal checkup. And when the doctor calls you, that's usually not a good sign. And he called to say your numbers are out of control. They are like terrible right now in every different kind of physical you can imagine. And it was a wake up call, because I remember that evening, just as if as if it happened, my wife and telling her, and her telling me, yeah, you can't get sick too. Like
Mm.
that's just not an option here. And I think for me, it was kind of a wake up call, as wanting to be physically healthy for a while, but always making excuses. I'm too busy. I'm so stressed out. I need outlets, whatever. I'm not doing like terribly sinful things. So just let me eat a bag of hot Cheetos, don't, whatever, whatever it might be. But something clicked where there was a different motivation that kicked in to want to realize I have to be healthy physically, at least. So from that point on, something changed in me, where my physical health, as much as everything else felt like I had no control, it was going in the toilet. I'm in the greatest physical health I've been in ever in my life.
Wow.
And thankfully it's continued now, even to this day. So I think it's been a real practical example for me. Even if things are out of my control, own it. It's okay to say they are, but what is it within my control that maybe I wouldn't have even recognized apart from this?
That's awesome. That's amazing. There's so much in that. We could go for so long just in all of that. What's one thing you wish people knew about your worst day?
For me, I think I don't look as put together as people might have thought I was. Um, Part of my imposter syndrome that had to be broken down was having to still be in leader mode, shepherd mode, um, and realizing even if someone looks like they've got it together, or even saying the right things, how can we try to discern whether that might be the full reality, or not to just let that go? And that's one thing. Again, that's no one's fault, but sometimes it's the world I've created around me to be very self-reliant. But to be able to, even the most self-reliant and people who seem like they have it put together, wondering what's going on underneath the surface of their life. And sometimes it just takes time and asking questions and being there for some of that to surface.
Yeah. Dan, you've been such an encouragement to me and inspiration, definition of a true friend. And I'm betting that somewhere along the way, someone's going to get a hold of this podcast, and their worst day is not going to be in the past, nor it's going to be in the future. It's happening as we speak, and that may be why they actually clicked on this podcast. What would you like to say to them?
Um, One thing I think, and I would remember studying through the book of Jonah during some of the darkest times. I think I had to actually do it for church, so I don't know if that considers actually studying, but having to do it. But I think the idea of Jonah being swallowed by the great fish, I think we think of that as a punishment, but actually God was saving him. God was rescuing him. And none of us are going to think being in the belly of a big fish, it's nasty, it's dark, that doesn't seem like saving. But recognizing that the way God will often reveal himself is through the ways that might be counterintuitive to our senses. And I think the thought I had was, for Jonah, at least, those days spent in that darkness were a sanctuary, a church. And not to diminish actual churches and religious spaces, those are all really good. But often the deepest encounter with our soul, who we are, who God is, will happen in the sanctuary of those irreligious spaces, the belly of the fish. And just encouraging people wherever they're at in how they believe about God or not, to ask, what is God trying to say with me? What is he inviting me into, even in the midst of this darkness I'm walking in where nothing makes sense? To trust, and not with platitudes of God's got it all when he opens a window, or, none of that stuff, but just God is present in even our darkest darkness.
That is so encouraging. One of the reasons why I wanted to start this series is because I wanted people to be encouraged. I wanted them to be inspired. I wanted them to be equipped and learn. But I also wanted to remind them, as you alluded to in the podcast, Dan, that they're not alone. They're not alone in what they're feeling, what they're thinking, what they're going through, how they're processing everything, whether they think they're doing a good job or a bad job, or you even mentioned like imposter syndrome and all these types of things. You're not alone. And I hope that you've heard that message loud and clear. God is there, but also there are other people who have gone through things similar to you. Some things worse, some things maybe not as bad, but there's a whole humanity out there that have hard days and have really bad days. And our encouragement is to find some type of a community, find some type of support if you don't already have it, and to just be committed to taking the next step that's in front of you. So, thanks so much, Dan, for bouncing in here and sharing a little bit of your story. I know it's going to encourage people and help people and inspire people and give them hope and remind them that they are not alone. Grace and peace, everybody.